Okay, um, let's kick off. Our third speaker in the session is Carl Fox. Carl is a lecturer in philosophy at Leeds University. Are you still affiliated specifically with IDEA, Carl?
Yeah, we're still in the idea center within the School of Philosophy, for whatever that's worth.
So this is interdisciplinary ethics applied, if I remember correctly, which I think speaks to it connects with actually the character of some of the work you do, doesn't it? So Carl works on various topics in applied ethics, media ethics, thinks about political obligation and distributive justice, amongst other things as well. Um, you're going to be talking to us today, Carl, about augmented reality, public statues and gratitude, and thinking about how some of these technical features to do with diverting people's attention to or away from certain things and the choices people can make about what they don't attend to might be evaluated relative to some broader concerns about freedom of speech and about obligations of attention and things of that kind, which is to say, continuing putting some more of these important sort of ethical playing pieces on the table for us. So please take it away, Carl. I'm very much looking forward to your talk.
Great, thanks, Ben. And thanks everyone for sticking around. And Ben, you've done a lovely job of trying to make it seem like this paper fits really neatly into the design for the workshop. But I imagine it's pretty clear that it's a fairly narrow focus, and probably a focus that was maybe more narrow than was originally anticipated. So narrow might even seem to be niche. But before I kind of jump into the hole that I'm going to dig for myself, maybe I'll see if I can kind of get you to jump in with me, because I think thinking about principles like gratitude might help us to think about some of the interpersonal worries that Chris talked about earlier. So obviously kind of one area we need to think about in kind of, developing and using augmented reality technology is how we do so in a way that's consistent with attitudes of respect and care that we're obliged to show to kind of our fellow people, right? So kind of if we're going to use augmented reality technology out in the world, um, you know, how should we go about doing that? Should we kind of take it off when we kind of like cross somebody's threshold into their house? Are we allowed to use other people as background characters in our video games? All of these kinds of things. Now, in one sense, you might kind of think that this is about etiquette, or kind of really about kind of like developing a set of conventions, but I think that might maybe slightly trivialize it, right? I think it's deeper than that. So as I say, it's really kind of about thinking about how these kind of attitudes of respect and concern that we ought to show people should be manifested, and how we can make our use and development of AR technology consistent with that. So we'll see what you think anyway. Hopefully this might kind of spark some fruitful thoughts, and we have some time for discussion, and I guess we can use that however we want, or at least however Ben deems permissible, so we can maybe kind of take that in various different directions. But yeah, so what I want to talk about is augmented reality as applied to public statues. And the reason I want to talk about that is because I guess kind of the early workshops did what they were supposed to do, which is they kind of got me thinking about augmented reality. And at the time I was working on a paper on statues. And so I thought, okay, well, if augmented reality is kind of coming down the tube, what's it going to look like? How are people going to use it with respect to kind of this particular thing? And I thought it's kind of relatively straightforward how they're going to use it, or at least I can imagine one obvious use to which it will be put, which is that when you're kind of walking around with your wearable tech, you don't just see kind of what's physically in front of you or around you, you see something else, even conceivably something completely different to what's there. And to an extent, it's already with us. So that GIF is from a Snapchat promotional stunt from 2019, and where kind of on the 4th of July in America, if you were near the Statue of Liberty, you could hold up your phone with the app open, and you didn't just see the Statue of Liberty kind of as she is. What you saw is the Statue of Liberty kind of moving around, waving the torch, and kind of fireworks going off. And that actually, I think, is fine. I've no problem with that. So we may many people might remember kind of Julie Williamson's talk early on, and Julie described quite nicely how we might use augmented reality to enrich memorials or other kind of public projects to kind of add content or add depth. And that seems, great. That might kind of help us to enliven them. But what I'm worried about is the next step beyond this, in which you use augmented or mixed reality technology to kind of put something else in your visual field that overlays what's there. So you just don't see it. You don't see the Statue of Liberty. You don't see whatever the kind of physical statue or memorial is, right? You head down to Parliament Square outside the Palace of Westminster, you don't see the kind of political figures or the historical figures that there are statues of. You see ultimately whatever it is that you want to see, right? Whether that be your favorite Marvel superheroes or the internet's 10 grumpiest cats, or conceivably your own preferred kind of political or historical heroes, right? So kind of, you might kind of, I don't know, sign up to Thatcher Cam or Trump Cam, and then kind of instead of seeing people you don't want to see or kind of people with whom you might have disagreements or political projects that you have complicated feelings about, what you see are kind of like what you would like to see and what suits you. And that strikes me as problematic. Now, I think it's problematic for a number of reasons. And I think there are lots of ways in which it's bad or kind of could be bad. And some of those kind of maybe connect up to things that kind of Chris was talking about earlier. So you might worry that this might lead to kind of greater polarization or something like that. But a lot of these kinds of concerns, I think, kind of have empirical aspects to them that might depend on seeing how the technology plays out for years before we can really kind of ascertain precisely how bad they are and whether that badness rises to the level where kind of licenses or justifies certain kinds of interventions, let's say, by the state. Now, when I was thinking about it, it kind of struck me that this strikes me kind of not just as bad, but as kind of wrong in a kind of more straightforward or kind of more principled way. So I was trying to think kind of like what was at the heart or at the base of that intuition. And what I came back to was a little bugbear of mine, kind of slightly different, but kind of hopefully I'll maybe try and make a case why it's connected. But there's something that kind of like bugs me that I kind of see people doing every day, which is they get onto the bus or other forms of public transport and they have their headphones on, their earphones in, their phones out, and they kind of don't interact or kind of pay attention or even leave themselves accessible to the driver of the bus, right? And that strikes me as problematic, right? That here's someone who's kind of delivering for you kind of service, they're doing something good for you, and you're not leaving yourself kind of open or accessible to them, right? You're not kind of making it clear that they could, if they wanted to communicate them, you treat them as kind of part of the service rather than as the person who's responsible for delivering this kind of good or benefit to you. So it seems to me ultimately that kind of like what bugs me and the reason why I kind of insist on making this kind of dramatic show of kind of trying to take out my earphone, which isn't usually very elegant, if like let's say kind of in the days of mask wearing where it's not easy to take out your earphone, but I do it anyways because it seems to me that kind of it's an appropriate way of kind of showing respect and care for the person. It's kind of really ultimately the same kind of thing or connected to the reason why you say thank you to the bus driver when you get off the bus, which is that it's appropriate to be grateful to them, and if you're grateful to them, it's appropriate to show them kind of like certain kinds of respect in various ways. So I want to make the case, or at least I want to try and make the case, that there is a principled reason why it would be wrong to use augmented reality technology to if you like, kind of completely remove or kind of significantly obscure to the point where important bits of a statue or a monument or some other memorial are kind of now missing from your visual field. And that the reason why, or at least one reason why that's wrong, is that it's a form of ingratitude, given that you're generally likely to be in a public space and you're enjoying certain kinds of benefits. Okay. Now, I should be a bit more careful here, and it's worth saying that kind of this talk seems quite focused. That doesn't mean that it's very well developed. It's still pretty rough. So it's worth saying that kind of when I say people ought not to, that has to be caveated, right? So I say kind of like other things being equal, and we might talk a little bit later on about kind of like potential exceptions to that. I also kind of want to try and kind of not just establish that it's wrong in a kind of principled way, but that the way in which it's wrong kind of implicates a duty that kind of licenses the kind of the entity to whom that duty is owed, which is to say the state, to take some steps to enforce it, right? And in thinking about that, kind of need to be quite careful, right? Kind of like, I don't want this duty to be too strong, because if it's too strong, it's going to lead to some pretty absurd conclusions, right? So kind of if the state was licensed to, I don't know, set up a new augmented reality core who could go around kind of ripping off your Google glasses and checking them, that would be too much. That would seem weird. That would be wrong. Also, I kind of don't want it to be the case that the kind of the reasons why I kind of take this to be problematic would also mean that kind of we can't do lots of other things that we do in public spaces near and around statues and other monuments and memorials that kind of use devices that in various ways consume or direct our attention, right? Kind of like if it was the case that it was now wrong to read a book in the public park or have your headphones on, that would be problematic as well. So I think kind of another reason why the principle of gratitude might help to do what I wanted to do is that it comes in at the appropriate level of strength, but we'll see what people think about that, right? So those are the two central claims. The outline of the talk, one thing I hopefully don't have to do because we've had all these brilliant workshops, is try and explain what augmented reality is, right? Kind of should be hopefully relatively clear. And because everybody kind of has that background now, I also don't need to take any serious risks about exhibiting my technological incompetence or ignorance, which would kind of be very embarrassing for everyone at this stage. So I won't kind of like get into that too much. Hopefully it's relatively clear what I mean. So I'm thinking mostly of kind of visual uses of augmented reality and mixed reality that can, as I say, kind of like overlay or kind of prevent you from seeing kind of like what's really there, and you only see kind of like what it is the kind of program delivers to you. I'll talk a little bit about public statues next and kind of why the state might want to use them, kind of like why it might be the case the kind of state has an interest in us paying attention in various ways to statues and memorials. I'll talk then about the principle of gratitude and kind of work through the kinds of steps you would have to go through in order to kind of get an argument like this off the ground and apply it to the context of augmented reality and statues. And then, as I say, if we have time, and we might talk about some ways in which I might want to qualify my claims or kind of deal with certain objections, because kind of most of the names I recognize here are philosophers, and I know how your nefarious kind of demented minds work, which is somebody presents a claim, somebody presents a principle, immediately ingenious counterexamples spring to mind. So we'll play that game if we have time. It probably won't be, well, it might be kind of a shocking lack of professionalism, but maybe not a surprising lack of professionalism. I haven't timed this talk, so at some point Ben might just have to hit the Zoom play me off button. But yeah, that will be as it is. We'll see how we go. Okay, so public statues. One thing I just want to kind of clarify is that while I'm going to talk mostly about statues in the sense that kind of, you know, if I can't think of another word, it's statues I'll come back to. Or if I can't think of an example, it's statues I'll come back to. But I think that kind of the scope of the argument is broader than that, right? So I think it covers other kinds of things that the state might do in order to communicate with the public, right? So really I'm interested in kind of public art as state speech, as kind of state expression. And I think kind of generally that will be the case when it's reasonable for a citizen who encounters it, and because it's on public land, because the state has commissioned it, because the state maintains it, to look at it and think, oh, I think the state might be trying to say something here, right? State might be trying to give me a message of some kind. And really kind of like that's what I kind of like take to be the kind of thing that kind of like we ought not to cover over or use augmented reality to avoid. So why might the state use public statues, monuments, murals, abstract art, whatever it might be, in order to do some communicating with the public? So what I want to do is kind of borrow pretty liberally from Corey Brettschneider, who kind of appeals to the value of legitimacy. So states claim the moral permission to, you know, tell us what to do, but also to back it up, right, with force, right? So kind of the states claim kind of the moral permission to kind of control the use of force in kind of whatever their territory is, and to kind of like back up their orders and kind of make us do it, right? So kind of they tell us how much tax to pay or to stay off the grass, and if we don't do what they tell us to do, they, you know, they send in the police and force us to do it. That's obviously quite a heavy duty permission, right? That clearly stands in need of justification, but political philosophers tend to think that it's not enough that there be a justification. They tend to think that the justification has to be in some way available or accessible to the public, over whom it kind of, if you like, claims jurisdiction, right? The kind of states kind of are supposed to make this justification public and kind of give it to the people over whom they're claiming authority. Now, Brettschneider goes a little bit further, which is the kind of thinks it's not enough that kind of the justification be there somewhere, right? That it kind of like be behind the desk in a public building, or that kind of you can get it if you go to university and kind of engage one of us in a kind of like a political philosophy seminar. He thinks kind of really kind of given kind of what it is the state is doing, the state needs to be in the business of promulgating this, right? So it needs to kind of get out there and make sure that kind of its citizens do have some understanding or appreciation of the underlying values it's appealing to, kind of when it claims the right, the moral permission to do this, right? So he kind of like calls this process of the state kind of communicating its underlying and fundamental values democratic persuasion. And he argues that not only is this something the states have to do in order to kind of to get this kind of public justification right, but it also kind of like helps to solve some other problems that states might encounter. So for instance, states kind of often grapple with, and we often struggle with, what are sometimes known as paradoxes of rights or conflicts of rights. So freedom of speech throws one of these up. Now, you might have different approaches to freedom of speech, but kind of whatever your attitude to it is, you're probably going to be somewhere on the spectrum of having to allow some noxious people say some noxious things. Okay, so maybe you think the neo-Nazis ought to be allowed to march through the town center. Maybe you don't think they do that. Maybe you think they get to have their meetings, right? Or their kind of neo-Nazi themed murder mystery weekends, or they get to kind of write their pamphlets and distribute them, or they get to have some corner of the internet where they talk, or whatever it is. But generally, most people think because this kind of liberty of expression is kind of important and kind of fundamental to people kind of becoming or kind of being treated as full citizens of the state, it usually means that we kind of allow in some circumstances, and indeed the state protects in some circumstances, the ability to hold and express anti-democratic beliefs, right, that deny the fundamental equality of certain citizens. Okay, now Brett Schneider worries that at least some citizens, right, those people who are targeted by these noxious beliefs, okay, might kind of feel ambiguous, right? They might kind of feel worried about kind of like whose side the state is really on if they see the state kind of protecting people kind of who are expressing these views. So Brett Schneider thinks we can at least kind of partially deal with this, and to use Johann Schulz's term, we can use the commemorative infrastructure of the state to kind of assure citizens that the state really is genuinely committed to kind of holding beliefs about their freedom and equality, that kind of like their moral standing and political standing kind of is something that the state will kind of act to secure. So this democratic persuasion can also kind of assure all citizens that the state stands behind them and ready to protect them. And indeed, we might think that kind of this kind of persuasion might also kind of like help to do a kind of civic education, which makes it kind of like less likely that particular individuals kind of will come to hold these hateful viewpoints. So I don't think it's the case that the state kind of uses all public art or all public statues or ever has historically to do this, but I think some of the time states do this, and arguably states ought to do this more, right? Kind of use statues to honor appropriate figures, right, whose kind of values are consistent with or kind of their lives have in some way embodied and the kind of like the underlying fundamental principles that kind of underpin the justification of the state. And if the state has a duty grounded in legitimacy to at least do some of this democratic persuasion, then it would seem to follow that really kind of they ought to try and do it well, right? They ought to try and do it effectively. So they have an interest in kind of people being open to the messages that they're trying to send. If it's the case that kind of it's really easy or straightforward to get augmented technology that kind of blocks out all these kind of statues and all these pieces of public art that are sending this message, then obviously it's going to be considerably less effective, right? So the state kind of obviously and clearly has an interest kind of that comes back to this kind of need for legitimacy to kind of do this well, right? To do this kind of democratic persuasion effectively. Okay, so on to gratitude. So gratitude is a kind of minor player, a kind of bit part player in the literature on political obligation, which kind of like is an area of interest for kind of political philosophers who are trying to figure out kind of like why it might be the case that when the state tells you to do something, you have to do it. You're kind of obliged or kind of required to do it because the state told you to do it. And there are lots of kind of different grounds for political obligation, but one ground that kind of pops up again and again is gratitude, right? So this kind of goes all the way back to Plato, and Socrates in the Crito kind of discusses or kind of he imagines the laws of Athens speaking to him as if they were his parents, right? Where they kind of say, look, Socrates, we've kind of delivered you all these benefits. We've looked after you all these years. What you owe us in return is allegiance, right? Now, gratitude hasn't fared particularly well as a potential ground for political obligation. Very few people think that it kind of does that job because that, if you like, obligation is such a strong one, right? Because kind of like so much is kind of being demanded. So really kind of often the kind of like the best that kind of people think it can do is maybe to be kind of part of a pluralistic account, okay? But it kind of looks like kind of maybe it's a weaker rather than a stronger obligation. That's a kind of view that Dudley Knowles takes, who of course kind of like was a fixture in Glasgow for many years. But kind of building on that, without kind of getting sidetracked or kind of drawn into the whole kind of political obligation question, it does seem to me that there's something to gratitude, right? It might not be that it's the kind of thing that can get you all the way or even anywhere close to something as chunky as the obligation to do what the state tells you to do, right? To kind of keep off the grass when it tells you to keep off the grass. But I think that we do. So it might seem kind of strange to talk about kind of debts of gratitude or obligations of gratitude. But in lots of contexts, we certainly treat gratitude as if it's something that is obligatory, right? So kind of it, when you're kind of writing that thank you card to your great aunt, it feels like an obligation, right? It's your moral conscience that's activated. We kind of try to inculcate this as a value in kids, right? And we kind of, do the things we do when people violate obligations when they don't act with appropriate gratitude. So we sanction them in kind of various social ways, right? We kind of engage in kind of certain kinds of harsh treatment when people kind of don't express or display gratitude in the ways that we kind of expect them to. So there's a conversation to be had there. People kind of still think it's weird, but it does seem to me that kind of like, at least in some circumstances, we recognize something like kind of obligatory gratitude. And so Dudley Knowles kind of says, okay, let's say if we kind of get that on the table, what kind of like steps would be in the argument that we would have to go through in order to establish that any particular entity kind of like had an obligation of gratitude to any other entity, and that the kind of the form of the gratitude kind of like would take would be something like kind of like acting in a particular way, or kind of like doing some particular thing, or kind of in this case, refraining from doing something such as using augmented reality technology in the way that I've talked about. So there's 3 steps. The first is that it has to be established that there's a genuine benefit that's being received. The second step is that kind of the entity kind of to whom the obligation is owed has to be kind of a fitting object for gratitude. And the third step is that kind of whatever it is you're trying to get out of it has to be an appropriate form that kind of gratitude could take or should take in these circumstances. So I'll just kind of briefly run through these and see if I can kind of make this work or kind of make this stick in the context of augmented reality and statues. So the first thing actually is just to say something else about kind of gratitude, which is just to head off another obvious objection. You might kind of like wonder if what we're talking about is the state, and the state doing things that the state is supposed to be doing. Well, how can you have a debt of gratitude to someone who's kind of just doing their job or just performing their own obligations, just discharging their own obligations? And John Simmons has a nice example, which I think kind of like brings out how it does seem kind of like appropriate or right that we would kind of have gratitude, and we ought to have gratitude to people who do sometimes discharge their duties. So he says, imagine a kind of like a brilliant surgeon, right? So this brilliant surgeon is kind of taking a break after a long day of transplanting spines or whatever it is, and kind of the way he likes to relax is he likes to drive his beautiful sports car around the country lanes near to the hospital. So he heads off and he quickly comes upon the scene of an accident. And kind of being such a brilliant surgeon, he can kind of see that this person at the scene of the accident needs to get kind of medical treatment within, I don't know, let's say it's kind of half an hour, an hour, something like that. So he needs to kind of get them back to the hospital quick. He knows that he can do it in his fast car, but he also knows that if he kind of drives around these kind of like country lanes, it's going to damage the car to some extent, right? Now we still think he ought to do it, right? He ought to do it anyway because it's in his power, but he's especially kind of implicated because as a medical professional with someone kind of like here in need of assistance and him being on the scene, he should do it. He should save the person, even if it comes at kind of some risk to his beautiful sports car, right? So kind of he's doing what he ought to do. If he didn't do it, we would treat him harshly, right? Even conceivably, he would be kind of at risk of sanction with Samaritan laws and so on and so forth. So kind of like it's not optional, right? There's a thing that he ought to do. But it still seems to be appropriate that kind of if the patient kind of wakes up having been saved further on down the line and learns that the surgeon had, as a matter of fact, kind of damaged their car and it's within this person's means, they should, pay the bill, right? They should get the car fixed, right? They owe something to the surgeon who saved them, even though what he was doing was morally obligatory. So it seems at least conceivable that entities kind of doing things that they're supposed to do or kind of obliged to do, kind of whether it be contractually or morally, can still be owed gratitude. Okay. So receipt of benefits. The benefit has to be something genuinely worthwhile, right? So kind of like if I give you a blanket infected with smallpox, you don't owe me any gratitude for that, right? That's kind of inappropriate. It also kind of like maybe that we have to, in order for gratitude to kind of get on the table, we have to have the right kinds of motives, right? So kind of maybe the benefits have to be given or provided in the right kind of spirit. So if you imagine a parent who, really doesn't like their child, resents having a child and kind of resents every penny that's ever spent on the child, maybe the child doesn't owe them a debt of gratitude at the end. Okay. So maybe kind of it might be that kind of you have to give it at least kind of like willingly to some extent. And it might be that kind of like maybe it has to kind of go above or beyond some minimum threshold in terms of kind of like how good the benefit is that you provide, especially if it's the case that kind of you're required to provide it. But these all seem like thresholds. I think that it's possible for the state to clear, and to clear in a way that kind of like captures up individuals as they're kind of encountering public statues or monuments or memorials, right? So let's have a little think about kind of the kinds of places in which you're likely to encounter statues and memorials, which is to say public spaces, sites that are open to all, provided for the benefit of all, what Jeremy Waldron calls common property, right? So kind of in the broadest terms, he says they're places where anybody can be, and that's the point of them, right? They're kind of like, you can read your book, you can have your coffee, you can exist there, right? So they're for you, okay? That's a benefit. But even more than that, right? It's not just that kind of public spaces are places where you can be. As a general rule, considerable effort and resources are usually expended to make them places where you would enjoy being, and places where you can pursue a range of other benefits, right? So kind of, you know, the public parks, for instance, in which kind of like lots of statues are situated, they're not like the exercise yards in prison, right? They're not kind of just kind of like spaces where you can just about kind of like, you know, walk around in a circle and take some exercise. They're nice, right? They're supposed to be nice. They're supposed to be relatively safe. They're supposed to be pleasant places to be. So these look like benefits, right? These looks like genuine benefits, right? So it seems relatively clear. It also seems to me, I mean, we'll talk in a second about kind of states and motivations, but that kind of the kinds of people kind of like who work for the government and provide these kinds of things, we don't have to go all kind of parks and recreation on it, but kind of that they're trying to do a good job, right? That they're not kind of resenting kind of like everything that they do to make the local park or the local public square nice, right? That they would quite like this to be kind of like a good or enjoyable place to be. So genuine benefit. Is a state a fitting object for gratitude? There's I mean, this is one of those kind of issues in which we could have a really long conversation or we could have a really short conversation. And I'm going to plump for the really short conversation, which is just to say we do it all the time, right? This is Dudley Knowles' thought, and I think he's absolutely spot on. That kind of just in ordinary language, we kind of certainly act as if and kind of behave as if and speak as if we can have gratitude towards institutions, and that institutions are kind of fitting objects for gratitude because they're the kinds of things that do have motives, right? They're kind of like, they are the kinds of things that kind of like can act for reasons that kind of have kind of commitments of various sorts, right? So kind of he says the only possible reply is that we do it all the time, okay? And he lists several examples of people doing exactly that. So there, I mean, I can imagine how somebody might object to this, and maybe this is something we can talk about, but I like the way Knowles kind of just brushes right through it and says, yeah, this is something we do. Why not, right? Why shouldn't we kind of like allow ourselves to do this given that we do it? So I think kind of like it certainly seems as if we tend to behave as if the state could be a fitting object, as if institutions could be a fitting object for gratitude. And then finally, there's a question about form, right? So what form should gratitude take? Now, the literature on political obligation, the kind of form that gratitude is supposed to take is that you defer to the state and do what the state tells you to do because it tells you to do it, right? Now, obviously, kind of like that's a bit of a reach in terms of, I think, kind of like political obligation, but kind of more pertinent to this question, what form do we think that kind of showing gratitude to the state ought to take, right? What do you get the state that has everything? Okay. And here again, kind of, we want to be careful, right? Because I don't want to kind of rule out kind of things like wearing headphones, reading books, daydreaming, Pokemon Go, stuff like that, right? So kind of like, I don't want a form of gratitude that's too severe or too demanding. So Walker, in a paper on political obligation and gratitude, makes a nice point that I think helps out here, right? So he kind of tries to distinguish kind of different aspects of gratitude and take it away from the thought that kind of like what you do, kind of like what gratitude about is kind of providing kind of, you know, like it's providing kind of compensation, or it's providing some kind of like equal benefit that's kind of roughly the same value as the benefit that you got. This is the kind of thing that gets us in trouble at Christmas, right? That kind of makes present, you know, receiving and giving so stressful, is that we focus too much kind of like on the value of the gift and kind of like how you might kind of reciprocate the value of the gift. And Walker thinks, well, kind of like, no, most of the time kind of like what gratitude is about is it's about displaying appropriate attitudes, right? So kind of you appreciate the benefit, you show kind of appreciation for the benefit, and you have goodwill and respect for your benefactor, okay? And that's kind of, you know, part of what you do when you kind of write your thank you card, right? You kind of explain how much you enjoy the gift, why it's so great to have, why you'll wear it every day, or kind of why you're wearing it right now, even of course they can't see it through the thank you card. But kind of like by following this convention, you kind of establish that kind of you respect the person who's given you the benefit, and show that kind of like you have an interest in their goodwill, that things go well for them. Okay, so how would you kind of do this with regards to the state in public spaces? So this takes me back then to the example of the bus driver, right? That kind of what you do by the way in which kind of like you appropriately show goodwill and respect, I think, is kind of, given the kind of entity they are, the kind of being they are, given kind of like the communication is kind of something that could exist between you, you allow yourself to be open or accessible to that, right? It's not to say that you have to ask them about their lives or kind of engage in kind of in-depth conversations every time, but kind of just showing that kind of you're not treating them just as another part of the bus, right? It's kind of, you know, where you get your ticket or kind of where you beep your phone, that kind of like they're a kind of like an agent who kind of like may in kind of some circumstances communicate with you, that's a way of kind of showing respect and kind of appreciation for who they are, right? So when it comes to public spaces then, and when it comes to statues, right, it seems to me that appreciating the kind of benefits of the public space kind of helps to explain why it's okay to kind of wear your headphones or read your book, right? That kind of by using the space in which it's kind of intended, right, which is kind of like partially to kind of like facilitate you in pursuing a range of kind of useful or worthwhile goals, right? That kind of it's okay to do a bit of Pokemon Go. It's okay kind of not to have your attention be kind of directed squarely at each and every statue or at each and every commemoration, but that it's important to remain accessible, right, to the entity that kind of like is at least kind of like in some way trying to contact you or trying to communicate with you. So you remain accessible. And the problem with using augmented reality technology in this way is that it can hermetically seal you off, right? So kind of the language of statues is a relatively crude one, right? It's kind of like, you know, it's kind of there. It's kind of like it's big, it's in your visual field. Sometimes kind of like it will, you know, kind of like spark maybe a thought in you, or kind of like you'll kind of like wonder who it is or kind of think about it. And that's really kind of like all I think the kind of like the state is kind of entitled to expect here, right? So you kind of remain accessible to kind of having that sort of encounter with the public art. And if you do that, that's fine. That's enough, right? And it doesn't kind of require you to kind of not, you know, enjoy or kind of do the other things in the park or the public space that you would have intended to do. Okay, there are some, how are we doing for time, Ben? When do you want to start me?
You've got 5 minutes, Carl, so
That's terrific.
make what use of it you wish.
Okay, so some boundaries to the view, right? So kind of, I suspect the moment I started talking about public statues, at least some of you will have been thinking about kind of like contested monuments and kind of problematic statues. And there is kind of an interesting question as to kind of what relationship members of oppressed minorities kind of like should have when they kind of like encounter these kind of statues in a public space. And it seems to me plausible that the duty is just not going to hold there. What I think is kind of more interesting is that if the state is or wants to rely on gratitude to do something that it has an interest in doing, then it needs to think very seriously about the circumstances under which gratitude is kind of, you know, appropriate or kind of like applicable or something you can expect, right? So if, for instance, a benefit is given in a really kind of patronizing way or really offensive way, we tend to think kind of like gratitude isn't really appropriate, right? So kind of like this might be a reason for kind of, you know, being very careful about how kind of you wrap up your message, right? So the state wraps up its message about fundamental democratic principles in a figure who is kind of like contested, well, then it just might not be the case that kind of those, you know, some people kind of like would really be under an obligation of gratitude to kind of engage with that figure, and were they to kind of block it out or whatever, they might be kind of excused for doing that. Also, if we think again about things like motivations, and kind of like circumstances in which maybe kind of gratitude isn't appropriate, things like kind of like the kind of like the hostile state or the hostile environment, right? So kind of like I know today, the kind of the UK government is rowing back from some of its Windrush commitments. But if kind of like people are entitled to feel that kind of what benefits there are being given in a way that is really begrudging, right? Or kind of like that doesn't really kind of like take appropriate account of their goodwill, then it might not be the case that kind of gratitude is an appropriate response to have. So the state might need to be very careful about the way in which it kind of does these things and the ways in which it kind of provides benefits if it wants to use, or if it thinks that it could use the principle of gratitude as kind of like a lever or a mechanism for kind of justifying any kinds of restrictions on people's behavior. So final slide, and then I'll turn it over. Which is kind of like what's the upshot, right? So the upshot, I think, is that it's at least plausible that in some circumstances, for some people, there is an obligation here, but it looks like a relatively weak one, right? Kind of gratitude seems to kind of generate a relatively weak obligation, the kind of thing that kind of like it's wrong kind of not to display it when it's appropriate, but it's not necessarily kind of like heinously wrong, right? So kind of like if it was the case that the state was kind of going to deploy kind of like jackboots tactics in order to prevent people from using augmented reality technology in this way, that would be going too far. That would just be too much, right? So I don't think that kind of, even if you kind of like buy the argument to this point that it's going to entitle the state to kind of, I don't know, prosecute individual citizens for using augmented reality technology in this way. But I think that maybe, given that well, if you kind of buy the thought that there is something like an obligation that's owed here, right, on account of the kind of the genuine benefits the kind of state provides, kind of in and around the kinds of places where we encounter public art and public memorials, that maybe kind of what it might do is it might kind of give the state a justification for discouraging the use of augmented reality technology, right? So kind of like maybe what it does is it kind of makes it kind of like illegal to kind of to make it or distribute it, or in some way kind of like makes it kind of more difficult for people to develop and have access to it. And that might be the kind of the limit to which it gets. But even that to me looks like it could be an interesting result and could be kind of like a relatively interesting way of kind of like justifying what would be a kind of a new and kind of public policy with at least kind of like some teeth. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl. Interesting stuff. I hadn't thought about this in connection with any of these AR things at all, so I think it is a good application case. Wonderful. So stop sharing your screen if you would, so we can see more people. And once again, I'd like to invite questions and comments. Fiona, why don't you kick off?
Thanks. So I was thinking about the comparison of watching state television, like say the BBC, and I don't think there's anything wrong with people not watching the BBC and only tuning into STV or Netflix or whatever. I mean, in a sense, you remain open to watching the BBC because you could change channel. And I kind of suppose I figure that might be true of, replacing the statues that you see on your walk to work or whatever. Like, I can always turn that off. I can always take the headset off if I want. But if I've decided I want to see the Marvel statues and not Churchill or whatever, then why not? It feels to me like quite a radical step to say. I mean, I appreciate that you said, well, people shouldn't be prosecuted or so on, but yeah, it just, when I think of that comparison to the BBC and then the sort of the thought, well, you've got to remain accessible, like there are ways to be more easily accessed, I guess, and the notion of accessibility is quite tricky here. So.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Fiona. So yeah, certainly the notion of accessibility is underdeveloped, shall we say, at this point in the talk. It seems to me, though, that maybe there's a comparison to be drawn here with imperfect obligations, right? Where kind of like there's an end that you have, let's say kind of charity, you're committed, or you're supposed to be committed to that end, but it's kind of up to you how you kind of like discharge your kind of like obligation to pursue that end, right? So if you give to charity kind of every so often, that's okay, but you don't need to give to particular charities. Now, kind of one of the things that's interesting about imperfect obligations is that there might be some situations in which the kind of the latitude of the discretion shrinks, right? So kind of, let's say that kind of just down the road from you, there's a terrible natural disaster, and kind of, you could open your home to someone to kind of like stay with you, and you say, no, I'm not going to do it now. Maybe I'll do it next week or the year after or the year after that. Or, do you know what? I'm really considering strongly sending some money to Oxfam, so don't worry about me. Now, under those circumstances, somebody might think, well, you're just not really committed to the end, right? It's not plausible, kind of like given the immediacy of the kind of event that's kind of like happened close to you. So kind of like, it just kind of like doesn't really make sense now for someone to kind of believe that you have the end in the way that you're supposed to. I guess my thought is that that's kind of true of someone who habitually wears augmented reality technology kind of like through public spaces, but kind of could always take it off, right? But they kind of like almost never do take it off. It's like, okay, there's a way in which you're accessible, but you don't really kind of like plan to take any serious steps to make yourself accessible. So it's like kind of conceptually possible that you're accessible, but you're not really accessible. The other thing to say is that when it comes to not watching the BBC, well, that's fine. If you're not watching the BBC, you're not getting the benefit. I mean, the BBC is a public good, and maybe because everyone else is kind of, I don't know, kind of like gaining other benefits that kind of enriches your culture in a way that kind of also comes to benefit you, but you're not directly benefiting from the thing, right? Whereas kind of if you're in a public space, if you go to a public park and you go for a jog or you do your park run, but you have your augmented reality tech on, so you're not seeing the statue, well, you're getting the benefit. You're enjoying the benefit that's being provided in the park, but the kind of the entity that's providing the park, you're kind of not treating it in the way that I think kind of like it would like to be treated, given that it has this interest, right, in kind of communicating communicating with you at least some of the time, right? So I
So,
kind of think
you might push back on that a little bit by thinking, well, the government allows, the government allows these antenna to be set up and allows you to buy a TV and allows there to be broadcasting of, in China, they don't allow broadcasting of other stuff or things they don't want. And like we have that kind of freedom that our state provides. So maybe you could make out as a parallel there.
Yeah, maybe. So I guess it kind of depends what point we're trying to establish, but kind of like there might be lots of reasons why we want people to support the BBC, and there might be lots of reasons why we want people to occasionally pay attention to public art, right? If it's kind of like trying to communicate certain values to us. So kind of like this isn't supposed to be exhaustive. This is just, I think, kind of like one reason why we might think somebody is doing something wrong if they kind of just shut themselves off or habitually shut themselves off from the kind of communication the state's trying to engage in.
Great, thanks.
Carl, I had a question for you, which was about this idea of accessibility, this thing that you've ended up with in your discussion with Fiona. I haven't worked out whether I think that I agree that being accessible to your sort of moral peers or your political community in this way is important, but suppose we take for granted that it is. I wonder if there's anything sort of specific about the way that use of augmented reality might make you inaccessible to your peers that it's worth focusing on. So one thing, for example, that marks the difference between somebody who is using at least some forms of augmented reality to somebody who's reading a book, for example, or walking around with headphones on, is that there are kind of clear external signals that are accessible to somebody else, that you are, for example, not in the same audio space as them, or that you're not attending to the same visual field at the moment. So if somebody wants to contact me when I'm reading a book, they know that they have to kind of tap me on the shoulder and get my book put away. Or if somebody wants to contact me when I'm wearing headphones, they have to do something other than just shouting. I think maybe the thing that's interesting about at least some AR is that not only not necessarily in quite the same shared sensory space, but also that fact might not be visible to other people such that it's not clear to them what they need to do to initiate certain forms of contact. So in the sort of spirit of trying to work out what might be distinctively problematic about sort of AR in the context of these questions of accessibility and gratitude, I wondered whether you thought that might be a key thing.
Yeah, so I think it would be. I think it kind of does. It's not going to apply to the particular case I have in mind, right? Because the statue doesn't need to tap you on the shoulder, or kind of that's not a concern of the statue to kind of like read the signals you're sending out. But kind of gratitude more broadly might make a difference to, I don't know, let's say kind of like whether or not you should wear your kind of augmented reality tech at the dinner table, right? That kind of like that might be problematic, right? Especially if kind of like somebody kind of like doesn't quite realize what they would have to do in order to engage you in a kind of meaningful conversation or get you to think about the thing that they want you to think about or whatever it might be, even if it's just kind of like passing the salt kind of stuff. So I think kind of like in the more kind of straightforward interpersonal scenario, yeah, I think there's a problem, right? Because kind of the cues are important, and if you can't read the cues, kind of it might make it more difficult to have the kinds of relationships that we want to have. So I mean, is that the kind of thing that you have in mind, or is it?
Yeah, it's definitely, that's the type of case that I guess it's more straightforward in, where I think you're right that you can make the case there. But I think maybe, I mean, maybe it depends upon the details of exactly who you think this debt of gratitude is and where to whom the obligations are born. Because if what you have is an obligation of gratitude towards your political community or state, which implies an obligation of some form of minimal accessibility to your co-citizens, then you might think that you're violating that by sort of invisibly making yourself sort of not part of the same kind of civic sensorium, let's say. That's a horrible phrase, but sort of taking yourself away from it in that sort of way, again in a way which is inaccessible because somebody can't work out how to bridge the gap, or it's not transparent to somebody how to bridge the gap. I know that's not quite how you were construing the relationship between the gratitude bit of your theory and the accessibility bit of your theory, but it seems plausible that there might be some connection there, and that might be where the link comes in.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, maybe there's a distinction to be drawn between kind of the content of a communication and kind of communication as kind of establishing or maintaining a relationship. And it
Yeah,
seems to be that kind of as far as the kind of the state is concerned, when it kind of does this thing, it's really more interested in the content, right? It wants you at least some of the time to think about fundamental democratic ideals and how they might bear on your conduct as a citizen. However, in other contexts, and particularly if we think kind of less of the state as an institution and more of the state as a political community, then yeah, we might want to think more about relationships and kind of what it is that kind of like we have to do in order to facilitate or kind of like enable relationships, and kind of, you know, making it clear to people, or kind of like allowing people to understand kind of what it is that they have to do when they want to initiate a conversation with you could be really important for doing that, because kind of in the absence of those kinds of cues, right, what you might fear is that kind of just lots of things don't happen, right? It's kind of too difficult or too awkward or too embarrassing. And indeed, I
yeah,
mean, there was a thought I was having in Chris's talk, which is one interpersonal worry you might have about augmented reality technology is just that it makes us really, really bad at interacting with other people, right? Because it kind of designs out opportunities to talk to people, right? If kind of you can get all the information you ever need through your classes, then, you know, you don't need to go to the help desk, right? You don't need to stop and ask a stranger for directions. And kind of in the absence of those kinds of interactions, yeah, you might easily find yourself kind of becoming detached, or kind of being, you know, your kind of social skills degrading to the point where the kinds of relationships we kind of think it's important for people to have are just no longer possible in the way that we want them to be.
sure. No, that seems right. Thanks, Carl. Fiona, your hand is up.
Thanks. So there was a really interesting case, which sounds very similar to the sorts of things that you're discussing, where I think it was in New York. There was a group of artists, and what they did was they created an augmented reality app so that if someone walked into, I can't remember which museum was, but it was a public museum, and they held up their phone, instead of seeing the picture that was actually there, they could see a picture that this collective decided should be there. And they sort of stressed how at the level of the technology that there is now, these pictures were very good sort of points that they could easily place digital art. And I just thought that this was a wonderful idea. I mean, they did it without asking the permission of the gallery. You know, you might think, maybe that's not great. But I just thought, imagine there's some people and they're so into art that they download this app, they go to this public space, and then they use the framework of that public space to enjoy other art exhibitions. I just thought that was wonderful. And I want to encourage people to do that kind of thing. They're not defacing the art that's there, but they are blocking themselves off from the art that's there. But it seems like for a very good purpose to enjoy, seeing art exhibitions. I would love to live in a world where my fellow citizens did that a lot. It seemed like a really good thing to do. So isn't that the very case that you want to tell us shouldn't happen? Like we should just go there and we should just experience the art that's predetermined for us there.
Fiona, there's only one possible answer I can give here, which is that it depends on how you use it, right? Clearly, it depends on how you use it. So that's fine, right? Why wouldn't that be fine, right? Kind of, and it seems like if the kind of the interest is just in kind of experiencing more and better art, then you do both, right? You'd look at the thing, then you'd look at the phone, then you'd look at the thing, you'd look as much as you could, right? So kind of like if someone kind of like has that motivation and the motivations of the collective art to kind of facilitate people who might not kind of necessarily kind of make it into these kind of art galleries or whatever, then yeah, that kind of like that seems like a win-win. Right.
But what you were reading, so just the case as you described it wasn't as I envisaged it. So imagine that you weren't at all looking at the art in the gallery. Let's say you had glasses on such that you never saw the art that was there, but you went to see the digital exhibition. Like that seems the sort of thing you're telling us isn't okay. And it seems to me that it is okay.
So, I mean, I'm not going to say it again. I'm not going to say the phrase again, right? But I guess the issue would be, right, kind of, well, so I mean, kind of like one kind of like difference might be in the kind of like the way that we interact with something like, let's say kind of like if it's an art museum, it's like you kind of pay some money to go in and you kind of like have the experience you want to have. So some things you might think it's appropriate to treat as kind of consumer experiences where you get what you want, or kind of like you can curate the experience as you wish to have it. But I think in other circumstances, yeah, there might be something that kind of counts against, right, you doing something other than the way in which something was intended, right? So kind of like if kind of I don't know, kind of like, let's say this was kind of like a public installation, and it was, I don't know, kind of like, really interesting kind of like artworks that people had done on, let's say, I don't know, kind of like oppression or something, and some kind of alt-right neo-Nazi comes in and kind of like as a stunt doesn't look at that, but only looks at some kind of horrible stuff that their kind of own internet collective has put up, then yeah, that seems weird. That seems problematic. So it's going to make a difference, I think, kind of like what it is you're trying to achieve and kind of what it is you owe kind of like those people who are providing a benefit for you. And under some circumstances, you might not owe them very much. Under other circumstances, you might owe them a bit more. And there's kind of like a difference in kind of like the form that kind of like your attitude of, or your kind of attitude should take. So yeah, I think kind of in the case of kind of like the public spaces and the parks and the statues, that kind of, remaining accessible to it kind of like seems an important way to engage with kind of like the state that's kind of doing this thing for you. When it comes to the kind of like the public art installation, it might just depend kind of like on what your intentions are and kind of like what your relationship to the art gallery is, and whether we think kind of like it's appropriate for you to have the experience that you want to have, or if we think that kind of there's something kind of like ungrateful to kind of, to kind of like resist any kind of like interaction with the thing that's been provided for you. Maybe kind of under some circumstances that might be problematic.
So what would you think this case was problematic? Suppose on my, in the public park, there's certainly a lot of statues, but I really like the statues that I once saw in Venice. And so I set up my AR app to put those statues there. Is that okay?
That strikes me as undesirable, right? So kind of like, if you kind of like really liked or kind of enjoyed that aesthetic experience, then, go back to Venice, right? Or kind of like scroll through the pictures on your phone, or kind of like do what it is. If you're kind of like in this public park and the state is trying to use this public park, part of the reason why it's there, or kind of like the way in which they're kind of exploiting it, is to try and get you to think about, I don't know, kind of like particular figures and the ideals they embodied, or kind of like particular political moments, then yeah, kind of like it makes me just a little bit queasy. Now, I don't think it's kind of drastically wrong, right? I don't think anybody should come and put you in prison for it, but it seems like, yeah, maybe there's something slightly selfish about kind of just using this public good kind of like only in the way that kind of you want, right? That kind of like only serves your goals, your ends, and nothing else, given that it's been provided for you, and given that the thing that's provided it to you also would kind of like you, at least in some circumstances, right? To kind of maybe think about the thing they want you to think about. So, I mean, it also might depend on kind of how often you do this. So this comes back to the accessibility question, but if you did it kind of once a year on your birthday or the anniversary of this life-changing trip, okay, maybe we don't care that much. But if kind of like you set your filter permanently, so that kind of like now your kind of local public park was just Venice all the time, yeah, that makes me kind of like worried that there is something slightly problematic going on.
Thanks. I think we just differ on intuitions there, but thanks. I appreciate your answers very much.
Wonderful. Well, I think the first thing for us to do is to thank Carl for a very stimulating talk and discussion. So thanks very much, Carl. Good work.
Sure. I've convinced nobody, but that's fine. That's philosophy. That's how it works.
Well, the brief wasn't to convince people particularly. I think the final order of business is just that I wanted to say a few remarks to sort of sum things up and to sort of say where I think we go next. So here in no particular order, a few thoughts from me about what we've learned this afternoon. The first thing is, isn't it interesting that we've seen great methodological variation between the three talks that we had this afternoon? We had somebody who started off with a kind of philosophy question of how we're supposed to approach these things, and then systematically went through some sort of proto principles or massive or important big high level considerations. We had somebody who started from a set of practical ethical conundra that arose in the context of technological work that they were doing. And talked through also some practical solutions to those ethical problems. And then we had somebody who started with this very specific kind of civic, political, ethical question, and then said, well, look, I mean, what does AR do in the context of this question? Does it exacerbate things? Does it offer a way of improving things? How does that tell us about the principles that apply to this more general account of the relationship between gratitude and our obligation to be accessible, and what might that say about the purposes of AR? I think it's useful to see this kind of variation, because it's really difficult to know how to do this kind of applied ethical work effectively. And diversity in approaches and seeing what works in discussion seems to be the best way of making some sense of that. So I'm kind of grateful that people took different approaches to the brief. I think we also learned a little bit about where we might end up in the long term in this project. Nice, neat categorical principles, I suspect, aren't on the menu. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because I don't think it means that we're going to fall into a relativistic swamp as the student who says, well, it all depends, that student fears. That's not the way that it's going to go. We can say, look, it all depends, but nevertheless find a way to articulate what we're aiming for instead and how it might be genuinely action guiding and critical for users, designers, and regulators. Few key ideas that emerged that stick with me. Talk about threats to privacy, threats to control of personal data. Those aren't quite the same thing. Problematic effects on relationships, that might be including but not limited to the effects on accessibility that Carl talked about. The effect of undermining consent or making it difficult to give genuine consent to the use of data, but to other things too, I think. One key question that I'm taking away from this is, look, is the framework of informed consent sufficient to its task to be the core concept, the core way that we regulate this type of technological development? I think I have a cautionary note that I wanted to think about there, which is, look, it would be very easy to think that the way that we deal with these things is just to inform users as much as possible, to give people lots and lots of information. Because if we give people enough information, we can make sure that the consent they give to this tech is informed and appropriate and efficacious, and that will kind of sort it. And then the risks that we've talked about, well, it's on their own heads. I worry a little bit about that, because it's possible to engage in a kind of information overload. And sometimes the things that we want from this technology depend, at least in part, on the features that make them problematic in that respect. I mean, one of the reasons why AR is so powerful is that it's outsourcing our agency to some degree, allowing us to sort of rely on something else to make judgments of salience, or stuff of that sort. And that can be a good thing. For kind of extended mind type reasons. Insisting on informing people to the nth degree might well be counterproductive in the sense that it just gets rid of the benefits of the tech, and sometimes it's cruel. Actually, this is a point made by Dudley Knowles, whom you mentioned, Carl. Dudley Knowles made the point that sometimes insisting on informing people so that they can tick a piece of paper saying they consent might not be at all the right thing to do in a particular context. So what that means, I think, is that the idea of using this tech in a way that scaffolds people's autonomy or agency is key. And I think that's a useful thought to have, because there's philosophical work on designing scaffolding in a way that genuinely upholds rather than undermining autonomy, consent, agency, well-being, and so on. And also because there's clearly technological work, which Sarah alluded to, about how you can use different forms of architecture and user interface within the apps to have that scaffolding rather than undermining effect. So I think that's the stuff that I'm going to take away from this and be reflecting on in the future. But I think there's an awful lot of rich stuff that's come out of these three talks. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending.